Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's a Ukraine War News Update. First part there for the 27th of May 2024. Today is Bank Holiday Monday in the UK, so a lot of people don't work. It's sort of a holiday day, national holiday day, although a lot of people still do work. But people plan things on this day. Quite often we have an 80th birthday party for Helen's mum. So we've got loads of family coming around. And then I'm out tonight to see a college friend, and my output today will be very much constrained by my things on the calendar, and I'm sorry if I don't get out as much as I want to. I will still be looking at my phone throughout the day and adding things to my list and getting frustrated that I've got all this stuff in my head that I have to talk about. So there'll have to be some kind of brain purge at some point, I'm sure. Anyway, let's go to where we normally start. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. Some of these figures are down from what we've seen, but then what we've seen over the last few weeks is a massive uptick due to probably the Kharkiv offensive, the Russians attacking south of Belgorod into that northern Ukrainian oblast. We have seen a lot of personnel loss due to what's been going on the front lines anyway, and then adding to that with another sector. 1,150 is a slight uptick from yesterday, but below where we have seen for the last couple of weeks. 9 tanks and 15 APVs are lower than what we've seen. 15 APVs, for example, is 1.5 sort of below the daily average, and we might think, oh, that's a poor day, but actually that's still a significant day. It's just that we have had pretty much since October, since the Russians attacked in Avdiivka, really heavy days of Russian losses. So that when you see a day when they lose 15 APVs, you think, God, that's not very good. but that's because of the range that we have seen. And if the UK army were to commit to a confrontation and lost 15 APVs and 9 tanks in a day, we'd be screwed. You know, that's an absolutely shocking day would be for us. Anyway, 28 artillery systems as well, although that's above average, you know, almost twice the average. It's lower than we have seen. 1 multiple launch rocket system, 1 anti-aircraft warfare system, 55 vehicles and fuel tanks. That's slightly up from yesterday. There was a lower day yesterday. And 7 pieces of special equipment. So a bit of a mixed bag. Some high numbers still, but lower than what we have seen, and some below average. Okay, the Russian and Ukrainian loss list as per Andriy Perpetua here, we can see about a 4 to 1 loss ratio of Russian to Ukrainian losses, given there's a couple of misses there, decoys. What we do have is the Ukrainians losing quite a bit of comms equipment, Starlink added there. As I often say, I wouldn't add that to these lists. Andrew does. By the way, Andrew doesn't make these lists for me or even necessarily for you guys. Like, he will have people who are interested in comms equipment. That's why that's on there. So I know some people are asking, why do you include this? Why do you include that? He's like, well, it's not really for you type thing. So that's worth remembering that you know, I am not the only consumer of this data, but when I say things like that, it's not to like that Andrew is making a bad decision to include Starlink. It's just like, if I was doing this list just for the purposes that I use it for on a daily basis, I wouldn't include that. But there are people that like to know about the comms equipment that's lost, etc., etc. Okay, so Strela 10, that's a short-range air defense system that the Ukrainians will rue losing. They obviously want to keep hold of all the equipment they can, and you get that range of air defense, like, for example, an anti-aircraft gun on the back of a Ural truck. That's going to be your lowest end, and then your S-400 or Patriot for the Ukrainians up here. And Strela is going to be short range and somewhere back here, nearer the lower end value stuff, but still everything's valuable for the Ukrainians, right? The problem here today, though, is these 3 radar systems, an unknown one, SNOV radar, and another ANTPQ-50 radar. Losing this capability will affect their ability to use things like the Strela 10. So their air defense systems, their air defense launchers are dependent upon, they're contingent on these radars being able to locate and acquire the targets. So losing them is a big blow to the Ukrainians there. There's a multiple launch rocket system damage. We have a damaged M1 Abrams tank and a damaged Bradley, but not crazy losses outside of those radar. Strela 10 is a bit of an issue. Right, let's look at the Russians here. So we've got 2 recovery vehicles, and again, the Russians losing those at a heavy rate. The crashed Mohajir 6 drone is included on this. That was that large, almost looks like an aeroplane drone that was found in a field in Russia. We've got a few bits of artillery, a few tanks, including a tracked garden shed, a Blyakty-mobile. We have a number of armored personnel vehicles, no, actually infantry fighting vehicles here, including a tracked garden shed added to a BMP instead of a tank. So this is where they put all that corrugated iron and all sorts of stuff around the tanks to make them look like a Mad Max mobile, and then send them out, usually to protect troops that are on board, and put hatches in that added protection to allow the troops to drop off. They do that mainly with tanks, but they do it with infantry fighting vehicles as well, as you can see. And then a lot of trucks and a lot of civilian vehicles damaged and destroyed to add to the list. So a much bigger list of Russian losses, but actually I think those radars that the Ukrainians have lost and that Strela 10 will mean that even though the ratio is right for the Ukrainians, they've probably had a bit of a kick in the shins there. Okay, Andrew Perpetua says, it's funny enough, I talked about this the other day. In the past, I've noted that Russia recovered only about 13% of vehicles from a specific 20 square kilometer area of the front. So that's when he looked at the Terny Tulska area and said actually 13.5% of these vehicles that we had seen before from previous footage have now disappeared. So they have recovered 13.5% of these vehicles. So he said that was 20 square kilometer area of the front. He said in another area there was only 10% that had been recovered in around a 14 square kilometer area. Well, now he's looked at another place, and I have another area that is about 30 square kilometers where over 90% have been recovered. That's a massive number there. The rate of recovery depends on a lot of factors, and I'm not sure you can simplify it down to a single rule of thumb. Some of this area is very close to the front, and a chunk of recovered vehicles are known to be totally destroyed. What I think's going on here, and he's talked about this before, because he's looked at, there was one vehicle that he had tracked previously, geolocated, and it's just a husk of a vehicle, right? There's absolutely no way you are going to recover that and it's going to be reparable, right? So there are certainly vehicles that are being recovered not to be repaired. Now, was there some kind of spare parts utility in a husk of a vehicle? Possibly. Or the other option is Russia really needs metal. Could it be that they are in such a desperate position that they're recovering vehicles for the metal to send them back to be smelted and then turned into new stuff because they just need that raw material? When we look at Andrew Perpetua's list, we see recovery vehicles are getting hit very regularly for the Russians. So they are doing it seems putting a concerted effort into recovering vehicles. What is the reason? Yes, they are obviously going to repair some, but some of them just are not going to be repaired. Right. Because I hadn't seen Andrew Perpetua list, but I have now. I got the Russian losses from Oryx today, or from Jakub Janovsky that still updates Oryx. And he had 85 for the Russian losses. A lot of equipment there. You can go and look at all that. So mainly sort of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and whatnot. There are some launchers for a book launcher for the S-400. So this is when the S-400 got blown up as well in OSA. So that's over the last couple of days. There's Zhitel, that's $200 odd million worth of kit. So this is over the last few days. So he doesn't release lists every day, but his list has 85 Russian losses, and then looking at the Ukrainian losses, 17 Ukrainian losses. There's a massive difference in the number there. So if you're looking at the ratio from another source here over a couple of days, you have just a huge difference. Sort of, what would that be? 5, so 50, 5 times 7, that's 85 versus 85. So that is a 5-to-1 ratio. That is exactly what the Ukrainians would want. And when you look at the types of stuff that's lost, that's very much in favour of the Ukrainians, but not including what Andrew's found, I think, in the last 24 hours or so. Anyway, just another source there to add to the picture. Absolutely hilarious comment on North Korean shells by a Russian soldier. The shells cause destruction among the Russian artillery units because they are unbalanced. Quote, the person responsible for supplying this crap is clearly a member of the LGBTQ plus community with a clear bias towards BDSM. That's what the Russians think. in terms of who is providing them with crap artillery ammunition. This is something we've heard a number of times, and there must be something to it that they are getting hold of poor quality North Korean ammunition. I mean, there's some real insulting language in here, but that just shows you how angry this person is. I mean, it is just full of invective that they are getting these substandard munitions. Precise weight distributions that do not differ from projectile to projectile. FU. We can only shoot from this piece of gloomy North Korean genius with a rope and armored armor. Why? Yes, because, and so on and so forth. It's just, my goodness, it's just full of invective. But they are not happy about some of the ammunition they are receiving. And here we have an IED being dropped from a Russian drone, actually quite high up here to drop an IED like that, but they get it spot on for that vehicle. Now, this is something that Andrew perpetually gets angry with an awful lot, because he sees a lot of this, which is overt targeting of civilian stuff. Right, there are an awful lot of bits of kit on these loss lists that are listed as civilian, but these are civilian vehicles being used in, this is a categorization of a type of vehicle, but they are being used for military purposes. So when you have a Bukhanka, that's like normally used as a civilian vehicle, but it's being used for logistics in the Russian army. A van, a car here being used to transport troops. We've got motorcycles being used all the time for attacks, but they are civilian vehicles. But that's how, and SUVs. But these aren't civilian SUVs. These are civilian types of vehicle being used for military purposes on both sides, right? Now, however, there are many, many examples of the Russians targeting civilian vehicles on purpose, knowing that they are civilian vehicles. And he says there's a 100% chance this is a civilian car, so it's just parked up at a farm. This is not a military area. Probably a farmer taking care of his animals. Russia just blow it up for literally no reason at all. Andrew's also many times seen a lot of footage that would be damaging to your psyche of old Ukrainian people civilians just being targeted, blown up with IEDs or mortar strikes. Particularly along the Dnipro River, they seem to do this an awful lot. He said that it happens so often that there's got to be some kind of rationale behind it, and he wonders whether there are drone units that train in this area. And their training they do because along the Dnipro River there aren't that many military targets. I've been there in Kherson. There are no military targets in Kherson. I didn't see a single military person, where everywhere else on the front line I went, or near the front line, there was just every other person at least was military. None in Kherson, and that's the same up and down that river, because it's just too risky for them to have military personnel put there. So what do these drone units do? They just target civilians and then use that possibly as training, and then go and get posted elsewhere to apply their training to actual military targets. Well, that's of course, war criminal activity. That. In Stavropol, a fire near the local headquarters of Putin's party, United Russia. So a bit more Russia on fire here. Don't know what's caused that. And again, railways being targeted at the moment. Actual rail carriages are rolling stock. Russia seems to be having more trouble, says Tim White, with transport than at any time since the early days of the war. In Ivanovo, another carriage mysteriously caught fire. It was stationary at the time. High probability of arson. Definitely something that's going on in Russia very consistently. Right, on to strikes, distance munitions. Not a lot to report particularly. A few points. There were apparently 7 missiles sent into Crimea last night, according to some Russian sources. I've heard absolutely nothing about these since. And as I say quite often, there are things that happen that we don't know about, and actually not a lot of information comes out about them, but they could result in high value targets being hit, but just we don't know, because it was not being reported on social media with people in, say, Crimea talking about it, or filming it on their cameras and putting it on the socials. If it's somewhere slightly further out, that's maybe a military specific target that's taken out with a missile and no one reports it, and the Ukrainians don't produce any satellite imagery about that, then these things can go unknown. So be interesting to see what damage was done last night, if any, whether there were indeed 7 missiles, whether they were all taken down by air defenses, whether they hit their targets. Often we just don't know. Right. Meanwhile, the Russians, according to Jay and Kyiv here, are hitting Ukrainian civilian infrastructure here. This is Toretsk, a residential building there struck by the Russians. This Toretsk is between Bakhmut and Avdiivka, right? It's by New York, Sumy, Toretsk, that kind of area. It does get targeted. Anywhere that's vaguely close to the front line will do, but it's just another example of what the Russians do. Now, there were claims, and I talked about this briefly yesterday. Starokonstantiniev air base was hit, or it was targeted by drones, cruise missiles, and the Kinzhal missiles that was sent. Was it 2 nights ago now? There were 12 cruise missiles, 31 drones that were shot into Ukraine as a whole, but some of those drones would have gone to Starokonstantiniev. I think all of the cruise missiles went there, and the 2 Kinzhals went there. 2 Kinzhals were not shot down. The claim was that 100% of both the cruise missiles and the drones were shot down. That's what the Ukrainians claim, and I often talk about how the Ukrainian stats seem to be realistic, because the interception stats, because quite often when they have a bad night and don't shoot things down, they will let you know. So there seems to be this range that would indicate accuracy in how they report it. Recently, they have had 100% or near 100% interception rates of drones, and I've noted that that's really good, that the Ukrainians seem to have improved there, and I hope it's true, and that they have had this improvement. But there were these claims on Russian social media, on Telegram and whatnot, that the airbase was successfully hit. Now, the Kinzhals probably would have got through, right? The Kinzhals were not shot down. There were 2 of them shot, and one would assume they would hit their target or near their target, right? So they would have got through. But there are claims that some of the drones got through as well, possibly cruise missiles. So there are claims by Russian telegrams that the airbase, the home of the 7th Tactical Aviation Brigade that operates the Su-24M, so those are the ones that release the cruise missiles, and the L-39Cs, they were hit by several missiles and Shaheeds in today's attack. In my opinion, unlikely we will get drone footage. We'll have to wait for satellites. So drone footage will not come from that, because the Russians, there is either they don't record the Shaheeds or they don't release them. But again, the Russians are claiming this. There are different telegrams. You can go and look at War Vehicle Tracker to see the source material for the claims here. But all we have is at least one interception visible near the airbase, caught on camera footage there. Don't know whether the Russians are being truthful there. Don't know whether the Ukrainians are being truthful, but I thought I'd let you know. Another over-the-horizon radar, a Voronezh M, this time in Orsk, in Orenburg region, was attacked by drones. Sources say that Ukrainian drones covered more than 1,800 kilometers, setting a new record. The consequences of the damage are still being clarified. I think there's a strong chance that nothing was damaged in the event, in the end here. But setting a record of drone, there's several things to focus on here. The range of the drones just seems to be increasing with each week. So I think this is 1,600 kilometers behind the enemy lines, and thought to have been a flight that was 1,800 kilometers in length. That is absolutely phenomenal. Voronezh M, the second point to note here is the target. So it's the second time in a week that an over-the-horizon radar site that would be used predominantly for the acquisition of enemy nuclear missiles into, well, not even into Russian airspace. These could have a range of 6,000 kilometers, I think. So this is very useful for the Russians in terms of their nuclear strategy. And this is why I was saying yesterday, it's quite controversial that the Ukrainians have targeted one of those. Well, they targeted another one here. So it's very clear that they are trying to hit these. And on a more systematic basis here. The Euromaidan press says the Voronezh M is part of Russia's family of long-range over-the-horizon radar systems designed to detect spacecraft, aircraft, and missiles at ranges up to 6,000 kilometers. So these can still be used to detect missiles sent by the Ukrainians into Russian territory or even within Ukrainian occupied territory. So it does have utility in terms of being a target for the Ukrainians, but also like it can go beyond that and into the idea of degrading the Russian ability to conduct a nuclear war. Shortest distance from the front line to Orsk is about 1,600 kilometers. The 1,800 kilometer route possibly implies a drone's launch from Kyiv Oblast in central Ukraine. So far, there's no confirmation that the attack was successful. On May the 26th, a local Russian Telegram channel reported that a drone crashed near Orsk and it is possibly targeting a military facility. This is coming from PS01. Today, Russians reported finding a Ukrainian drone 1,500 kilometers from the Ukraine. Near Orsk, not far from another electronic warfare radar. It seems that the drone had for target another Voronezh M radar early warning. It seems that the drone started a fire in the fields about 16 kilometers from the radar. Interesting there. And just to finish off the original, the drone was likely about to turn to strike the radar frontally, says PS01. Goodness me. So that is, I think, a really significant targeting there. And it'd be interesting to see what the Russian response is. Now, the Russians yesterday hit Zaporizhia airport. This is really sad. I mean, that's what it would have looked like during peace times. Nice looking airport there, modern facade. Now that's what it looks like. And Russian strike on the new terminal of the civilian airport in Zaporizhia today. Ukraine is not allowed to strike military airfields in Russia with Western weapons, on the other hand. That's again what it looked like. Another image. Ilya Ponomarenko saying Russia simply destroy any glimpse of human civilization and comfort they can and turn it into rubble, graveyards, and ashes. So that was targeted. But not too much else happened last night from what I can gather. We'll move on to this. So if you remember, and there's still, unfortunately, fallout coming from the hypermarket, the Epicenter hypermarket, that huge hardware hypermarket that was hit in Kharkiv, that there are still missing bodies. In fact, one was found this morning under the rubble. Here are Ukrainian. I'm including this because sometimes we forget about, like, if I just say 17 people are missing still and 16 people died or whatever these statistics are, these are numbers and we forget the human ramifications of this. Here we have an 8-year-old boy, Mikhailo, waiting for DNA identification of his father's body. The man worked in a shopping mall in Kharkiv and was inside at the time of the attack. That's a reality. A small boy presumes his father is dead, has to have a DNA sample taken so they can see whether one of those bodies that they have either found or they're likely to find is indeed his father. It's just deeply saddening. And from this war, I think there have been some incredible photos. Unfortunately, the photos are incredible stylistically, but they're horrific in terms of often what they show, or beautiful in terms of what they show in terms of heroism. There's just a whole range of imagery that's come out of this, and some of it is really quite arresting. Instead of 1,000 words, says Anton Gerashenko, this photo was taken by one of the firefighters in the Dnipropetrovsk region as they extinguished a fire after a Russian strike. A huge hole in the ceiling was left by a Russian drone. The hole is now in the hearts of each of us. This is the wound that hurts everyone, for every city and village, for our people, for Kharkiv Oblast, Kherson Oblast, Sumy, Chernihiv, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Odessa, Mykolaiv Oblast, for every piece of our land, according to state emergency services. That's what they wrote concerning this photo. Quote, while you're reading these lines, the Ukrainian defenders are firmly holding the defense. Our emergency workers of the state emergency service eliminate fires, rescue and evacuate people, and dismantle debris. They added. Just quite an incredible photo there. Almost looks, AI generated. That's how typically iconic it looks in terms of the rays of light coming through, and just a brilliant photo. But as brilliant as it is heartbreaking. Looks like Captain Vodka has been working well for Ukraine again in Russia. So somehow in Rostov, the bulk carrier Zelenga crashed into a railway bridge over the River Don. Hopefully the bridge is a key military route and is unusable. This is rather reminiscent of the bridge in the US recently, although not nearly as big a ship and as catastrophic as that bridge. But yeah, that looks pretty unfortunate there for the Russians. This is in the same day that two ships in St. Petersburg, boats crashed into each other. One was a tourist boat, the other was I don't know if it's a cargo boat or something. Anyway, in 24 hours there were like two fairly significant boating accidents in Russia. The situation with the electricity grid in Ukraine may soon deteriorate, reports the Ministry of Energy yesterday. After scheduled repairs, the nuclear unit of one of the nuclear power plants was connected to the power grid and is now gaining power. However, several nuclear units are preparing to undergo repairs to prepare for the heating season. So already they have to start preparing for obviously it takes months and months to repair some of these really catastrophic hits on the energy infrastructure, and they need to start preparing for autumn into winter now. Nuclear, I think, is going to be key because the Russians are going to be less likely to strike at nuclear power plants than they are at things like thermal power plants because of the issues of radiation and fallout spreading across Europe in the same way the Chernobyl disaster did. And they would be seriously blamed for that. And that would, I think, force a reaction that would be akin to using a tactical nuke. Personally, so I think that would be one of those red lines for NATO in the West, possibly even China, to say, hey, that's not cool. Right, just going to go through a comment here because I think this is something we need to talk about. I need to talk about. I need to do a separate video on this. Jonathan, I appreciate your efforts, time and support you put into Ukraine. I see no one else with your level of passion and dedication. Thank you very much. I would like to understand how you see Ukraine ever being able to retake their territory occupied by Russia. This is such a big question or topic that I need to grapple with. I think this is difficult, and I think while we can see Ukraine prevailing, what does prevail mean? What does succeed mean? And what's the actual pragmatic likelihood that you'll see Russia kicked out of all of Ukrainian territory so it gets back to 1991 borders? That's what we'd all like. That's what is right here. But actually, how easy is that? Both in terms of the people who are living there, many of whom have been shipped in by Russia, but also dislodging the military from there. There's one thing doing all these distant strikes that are absolutely hammering Russia, but there's another thing then getting to the point where you have to move the Russian troops, given they've got fortifications and minefields, out of that area. That's the difficult part. The easy part for me is sitting back for 6 months, getting a load of weaponry from the West and hammering Russia so that Russia gets crippled. But that kind of stuff will not particularly affect the front line and the personnel and equipment lined up on the front line. So your man here says this is one good guy. I presume that YouTube studio changes there. Yeah, it is one good guy. Okay, so his assessment is the military aid Ukraine is receiving will allow Ukraine many successful strikes over the next 6 months. I'm sure this will save many Ukrainian lives, destroy many Russian assets, and help repel Russian advances. However, no matter how impactful the Ukrainian strikes will be, it does not gain Ukraine territory. The aid packages from the US is said to run out by the end of this year. What then? The current military aid was almost unattainable. I think additional military aid from the US will be nearly impossible, even if Biden wins the election. Definitely impossible with Trump. With Ukraine's current lack of manpower, Ukraine is barely holding defensive lines. Ukraine has activated its mobilization, and mobilization lowered the age requirement, but nothing has prevented younger age Ukrainians from voluntarily joining the armed forces since the war started. Unfortunately, for this reason, I think the mobilization will have a disappointing result, and I think that's a realistic appraisal there. 300 Ukrainian soldiers are dying daily. Conservative estimate, I think that's 9,000 a month, 54,000 in 6 months. Ukrainian personnel losses may be significantly higher than this. Russia is suffering massive personnel losses, but can be replenished. Okay, harsh claims here, but probably fairly accurate. So my conclusion is that in 6 months, Ukraine, this is not my JP's conclusion, this is one good guy who says Ukraine will have had devastating success against Russian assets, manpower and infrastructure, but this will not allow Ukraine to retake any significant territory. Ukraine will be out of military aid. Ukraine will have the same or less manpower than now unless other countries commit troops to Ukraine. I see no possible way for Ukraine to take and hold territory. Maybe not even hold current territory. Basically, every inch of territory Russia takes now, they will keep. The only chance I see of Ukraine ever regaining its territory again is if military aid is continued and tens of thousands of additional troops are provided by other countries, or if the Russian government is changed a military coup. So that latter point, I think, is one of the biggest hopes for Russian troops to move back, and which is possible. But the question is it probable, even if Ukraine prevail in these distance attacks? Do you agree with my assessment? Broadly, yes. If not, please explain where you see this war will be in 6 months. I think I'm going to do a separate video on this. I'm not going to talk about it now. I don't have time. But really great comment, this. Thank you for this comment. How will Ukraine be able to mount a counteroffensive, if at all? I appreciate the day-to-day status of the war, but I do not see any vloggers making detailed and intelligent long-term assessments and outcomes. I will do that for you. Thank you for that comment. Really appreciate it. Right, that's enough for me today. I got these memories on Facebook. So you know when they give you like pictures, this is how you used to be. Like, as many of you know, I've got primary progressive multiple sclerosis. I am disabled. And just a personal bit, I will link this back to Ukraine. So I got a picture of like, oh, this is you. I don't know how many, like 17 years ago or something, and 16 years ago, like playing rugby when I used to play for Romsey Rugby Club. And then this is me playing ultimate frisbee. Actually, I'm missing the disc there. That's embarrassing. Anyway, that's me like a gazelle 17 years ago. I was like, oh, look at me 17 years ago. Like, I'm at a position now I know there are a number of disabled people that watch this, that you do reach out to me. I know I will never run again in my life. Like, I physically cannot run, and I'm not going to get that back. And that's quite a sad thing for me to think. I would never, there's nothing that I can do realistically that will allow me to do this. I simply cannot run. My legs just cannot do it. I would fall over straight away. That's really sad for me, and I think I can never play football with my kids. I used to manage their football team. I used to help coach their rugby team. Like, I can't do that now. It's physically impossible. And then I think, well, okay, so what? That's just me. Who cares? Stop whinging. That, you know, that's irrelevant to what we're doing here. And then I think, what about all those disabled people in Ukraine? How have they been affected by the war? So when an aggressive nation comes and invades your country, and you think it's terrible in all these prima facie ways, like all the death that's been caused to civilians on the front line or near the front line, to the troops, etc., and then you hit the energy infrastructure and the effects that has. How is this affected? So if Ukraine is giving 35% of its, is it 35% of its GDP is going towards a war? Like, that's money that otherwise would have been spent on the welfare state, like helping people with disabilities, helping children with their education. Like, what are the other outcomes of this war? What are the ways that this war affects other demographics of people and disabled people like myself? And I'm all right. My upper body's still fairly okay. Like, it's not great. I can't feel my fingers, all that kind of stuff. But my brain is about 15% off what it was. Like, my short-term memory is not great. I struggle with words, but I can still at least, you know, earn a living and do what actually I love doing. It's weirdly, in some ways, I'm in a better place than I was before when I was a teacher and whatnot. Like, although I loved it, I was getting disenchanted with the whole thing. This, I'm getting mental exercise every day, and I'm talking about things that truly interest me, and I'm interacting with a lovely bunch of people online, and actually that's brilliant, and I love doing what I do. But that's really lucky. I'm in a really privileged position. imagine being disabled in Ukraine. What would your life be like that? I'd love to interview someone, maybe who's physically disabled from the war, or maybe people who were disabled in different ways, and then have what their experiences of being disabled in a war, in a country that is war torn. Anyway, just some random thoughts that came out of like looking at me, and it kind of reminded me. Yesterday, I showed you a video of someone who was a tank a commander, or is in charge of a bunch of recruits who were training in the UK on the Challenger 2 tanks. And he was interviewed, and he's said, sometimes I look at pictures of me, and it can only be sometimes a few months ago, maybe a few years ago, and it's a different person. And I look at that person and think of the experiences I've had now during this war, and I look at that, and that was me then, but it's not me now. And it's interesting because I have that exact same experience. We all have that exact same experience. When we look at ourselves in different contexts and go, God, look at me then. It's like a different me. And I could get philosophical about the continuous I, that there's no such thing as a continuous I. We're just almost reinvented different iterations of ourselves on an ongoing basis throughout time. But anyway, that's a whole, if you want to look at personal identity over time, that's a fascinating philosophical topic. But there, anyway, I'll leave it at that. You can go and think about those ideas. Take care, guys. Speak soon.